move past their failure to repeal and replace Obamacare. President Trump, Speaker of the House Paul Ryan, and Vice President Mike Pence have their eyes set on another major campaign promise: tax reform.
We'll probably be going right now for tax reform, which we could have done earlier, but this really would have worked out better if we could have had some Democrat support. Remember this, we had no Democrat support. So now we're going to go for tax reform, which I've always liked.
This does make tax reform more difficult, but it does not in any way make it impossible. We will proceed with tax reform. We will continue with tax reform. That's an issue I know quite a bit about. I used to run that committee. We're going to go fix the rest of the tax code.
We're going to roll our sleeves up, and we're going to cut taxes across the board for working families, small businesses, and family farms. Working with this Congress, President Trump is going to pass the largest tax cut since the days of Ronald Reagan, and we're going to get this American economy moving again.
All right, joining me now is Grover Norquist. He is the president of Americans for Tax Reform. Good to see you.
Good to be with you.
All right, so do you think it's possible for tax reform, the biggest one since Ronald Reagan, according to the vice president, to be passed?
The answer is yes. By undermining the president's health care reforms, it takes $1 trillion of taxes that should have been gone. The Freedom Caucus owes the American people $1 trillion by undermining the president's effort on health care. Now we go to tax reform. You're looking at a substantial tax reform commitment, both by the president and the Republican caucus. They're taking the corporate rate from 35, highest in the world. It's why we're not as competitive as we need to be, down to 20%, going to full business expensing. So all new business investment goes immediately expensed rather than over a long period of time. Takes the individual rates down to 3 rates instead of 7, dramatically increases the personal and family exemptions, gets rid of the death tax, gets rid of the AMT. It is a very pro-growth set of policies, as stronger than Reagan's in 1981, which brought us 4% growth. We're down below 2% now.
So all of that will require alliances on the Hill. This morning, Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer had this to say about Trump's path forward.
They ought to get rid of repeal, drop it. It's been a flop for them because of the substance of repeal, and work with us to improve it.
One of the things that unites Republicans is tax cuts. And I think we just heard some pretty big news there from Chairman Meadows saying tax reform doesn't mean that you have to pay for all of your tax cuts.
If you analyze, George, what went wrong with ACA, the president exhibited 2 traits that are not very helpful. And if he repeats them in tax reform, they'll get nowhere. The first is basic lack of competence. You cannot run the presidency like you run a real estate deal. You can't tweet your way through it. You can't threaten and intimidate and say, I'll walk away. It's more complicated. But even more to the point, the president campaigned as a populist against the Democratic and Republican establishments. But he's been captured by the hard right, wealthy special interests. That's who loved his proposal on the Trump care, because it gave huge tax cuts to the rich. If they do the same thing on tax reform, and the overwhelming majority of the cuts go to the very wealthy, the special interests, corporate America, and the middle class and the poor people are left out, they'll lose again.
So what are your thoughts on that? Because those were a couple of, points you made on lack of, competence. You can't intimidate people, and that he accused the president of, really appealing to the hard right wealthy.
Yeah. Here's the challenge that Chuck Schumer has in the modern Democratic Party. It's moved so far to the left over the last decade. It's shrunk into a series of cities instead of being a national party as it once was. There isn't a single Democrat who is willing to vote for any reform of Obamacare. They spent 8 years defending all of the mistakes. Bill Clinton, who didn't have to run for office, said it was crazy. He was able to speak the truth about Obamacare, which the insurance companies loved and all the big businesses that were at the table when they wrote it. Those are the guys who are not happy at all at getting rid of all the special subsidies that Obamacare had for various corporations. Those all go away when we finally get rid of Obamacare. On tax reform, there isn't a single vote on the Democrat side for fundamental tax reform that solves the problems that we have in being non-competitive. We had 6, 7 years where Obama kept saying he was willing to do something on tax reform, and the only thing he ever did was demand $1.4 trillion in higher taxes as part of any deal, meaning no reform was possible. So tax reform will pass. I think it's better to make it permanent, which means you put it in a situation inside the reconciliation package so that it's deficit neutral in the out years. You can do it the way Bush did it, which is a tax cut, but it only lasts 10 years. The reason it was important to do health care first is that was $1 trillion in tax cuts, $1 trillion in spending restraint. It makes fundamental tax reform much more possible. The people who stabbed the president in the back and undermined health care reform did tremendous damage to the effort to get tax reform. May not be dead, but they damaged it, and that's where we need to get it fixed.
But won't it take a building some kind of common ground with some of the very people that the president criticized for not being on board with health care? Democrats, conservatives.
Look, you have 90. No, but there are no Democrat votes for cutting taxes. There are Democrat votes for raising taxes.
But there were no
That's
votes
what Obama
from Democrats
wanted.
on the GOP plan either.
Well, 90% of the Republicans are on board, both on where the president was on health care. Some people thought they could have negotiated a different deal. Turns out they couldn't.
So you don't see that as a blueprint for what's ahead as it pertains to tax reform or even an infrastructure bill?
No, because first of all, tax reform will have to, unfortunately, because the Democrats have moved so far left, be a Republican-only bill. But the votes are there for it. You also have every small businessman in every congressional district knows exactly how important tax reform is to the grocer and the butcher and every self-employed person and every small business in those districts. No congressman's going to be able to do to his constituents right in front of them what they did to Trump on health care reform. I believe they'll come back and fix health care reform, but we will certainly get a very strong tax reform package.
Okay.
That one will happen.
We'll leave it right there. Grover Norquist, good to see you. Thank you so much.
You got it.
All right, dozens of prisoners on the loose after escaping from a massive tunnel in a prison. An update on the hunt to find them next.